Cold coffee tastes like failure. It is a sharp, metallic flavor that clings to the back of your throat, a daily reminder of unpaid bills and shrinking dreams. She drank it every morning, staring across a cramped kitchen at a husband who smelled of turpentine and dead ends, entirely unaware that the man struggling to pay their heating bill actually owned the conglomerate that held their lease. We crave what we don't have, eagerly trading quiet gold for cheap brass, simply because the brass catches the light. Poverty does not happen all at once. It is a slow, grinding friction that wears down the edges of a marriage until all that remains is raw nerve. Chloe stood at the sink, digging her fingernails into a bright yellow sponge that was rapidly shedding its abrasive backing. The water ran cold. It had been running cold for 3 days. She scraped at the bottom of a cheap aluminum skillet, watching the congealed grease smear across the metal rather than wash away. The smell of burnt onions and cheap dish soap filled the tight galley kitchen, making her stomach turn. Behind her, the rhythmic, grating sound of sandpaper against wood echoed through the apartment. Jonah was at the kitchen table again. He was always at the kitchen table. His broad shoulders were hunched over a salvaged dining chair he had found abandoned on the sidewalk 3 blocks away. Wood shavings littered the peeling linoleum floor, catching in the sticky patches near the refrigerator. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the cuffs frayed into soft white threads, and his hands were coated in a fine layer of pale dust. "I can smell the varnish from the bedroom," Chloe said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the irritation she actually felt. She had bypassed anger months ago. Now she was just tired. Jonah paused. He blew a stray curl of wood off the seat of the chair and looked up. His eyes were a startling, clear blue, but they always seemed focused on something 6 feet behind her head. "I'll open a window. The joints were loose. Just needed to reinforce the dowels before the glue set. It's 38 degrees outside, Jonah. If you open a window, we won't be able to feel our hands." "Right." He set the sandpaper down, the grit making a soft, scratching noise against the table. "I'll take it out to the fire escape." "Sorry, Chloe." He wasn't sorry. Or rather, his sorrow was a passive, useless thing. He scooped up his tools with large, calloused hands, his movements slow and deliberate. That was Jonah. Everything was deliberate. Nothing was urgent. He had spent the last 3 years finding his footing after what he vaguely called a corporate burnout. He built furniture nobody bought, fixed electronics for neighbors who paid him in 6 packs of cheap beer, and seemed entirely, infuriatingly content with a life that felt like a slow suffocation to her. Chloe turned off the faucet. The pipes gave a violent shudder, a loud clank echoing behind the drywall. She dried her hands on a towel that smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how many times she washed it. "The electric bill is sitting on the counter," she said, not looking at him. "I saw it. It has a pink banner across the top this time." "I know. I'll take care of it." "With what, Jonah?" She finally turned around. He was standing by the door, balancing the half-sanded chair against his hip. He looked like a photograph from a bygone era, all rugged angles and quiet stoicism. It made her want to scream. "Are you going to trade Mrs. Gable's toaster repair for kilowatts? I don't get paid until next Friday. My commission from the Hastings property hasn't cleared because the buyer backed out." Jonah shifted his weight. The floorboards whined under his heavy boots. "I have some savings left. I'll make the transfer today." Always some savings. A nebulous, dwindling pool of money he refused to explain, likely scraped together from odd jobs or a small inheritance he had never fully disclosed. It was enough to keep them from drowning, but never enough to pull them out of the water. Chloe walked past him, her shoulder brushing his chest. He smelled intensely of cedar wood and stale coffee. Once, that smell had meant safety. Now, it just smelled like stagnation. She went into the bedroom, pulling her only tailored blazer from the cramped closet. The lining was beginning to tear near the armpit. She carefully tucked the frayed fabric inward, slipping her arms into the sleeves. She worked as a junior associate at a boutique real estate firm catering to the ultra-wealthy. Every day she walked through penthouses with heated marble floors, sweeping panoramic views, and custom wine cellars. She handed keys to men and women who dropped $3 million with less anxiety than she felt buying a carton of eggs. Then she rode the subway home, her cheap heels blistering her heels, back to a radiator that clanged in the night and a husband who sanded garbage in their kitchen. She slipped her feet into her pumps. The faux leather pinched her pinky toe immediately. "You look nice," Jonah said from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, watching her adjust her collar in the warped mirror. "I have to show the Mercer penthouse today," she said, grabbing her tote bag. "It's a huge client. If I can close this, the commission covers 3 months of rent. Maybe we could even fix the heating." "Just don't let them walk over you, Chloe," he said softly. "Those guys, they smell desperation. You have to look like you don't care if they buy it or not." She paused, her hand on the doorknob. She looked at her husband, his dusty clothes, his scuffed boots, the serene, unbothered expression on his face. A sharp, ugly spike of resentment pierced her chest. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice tight. "Thanks for the business advice." She closed the door behind her, the heavy click of the deadbolt echoing in the dim hallway. She didn't look back. The Mercer penthouse smelled of ozone and fresh paint. It was an antiseptic, expensive scent, the kind that indicated no human being had ever actually lived there. Chloe stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling yellow cabs 50 stories below. The glass was perfectly clear, offering no barrier between her and the city, yet making her feel entirely untouchable. The elevator chimed, a soft, pleasant hum that signaled the arrival of the private carriage. Chloe smoothed the front of her skirt, pasting on a practiced, neutral smile. She turned just as the heavy oak doors slid open. Richard walked in. He didn't just enter the room, he displaced the air inside it. He was dressed in a dark navy suit that draped perfectly across his shoulders, the fabric absorbing the harsh afternoon light. His shoes, a deep oxblood leather, made no sound on the polished hardwood. He was flanked by a silent assistant who immediately retreated to the foyer, leaving Richard to stand alone in the center of the massive living room. He didn't look at the view. He didn't look at the vaulted ceilings. He looked at Chloe. "Chloe," he said. His voice was a rich, low baritone, completely stripped of regional accent. It was the voice of boardrooms and private jets. "Richard Hayes, we spoke on the phone." "Mr. Hayes, welcome to the Mercer." She stepped forward, extending her hand. When he took it, his grip was firm and dry. His skin felt unnervingly smooth, manicured and soft, entirely unlike Jonah's rough, splintered hands. He smelled of bergamot, crisp linen, and something faintly metallic. It's smaller than the photos suggested, Richard said, finally breaking eye contact to scan the room. He didn't sound disappointed. He sounded like a man who habitually found flaws to establish dominance. The square footage is primarily in the master suite and the wraparound terrace, Chloe countered smoothly, falling into her routine. If you prioritize entertainment space, I can show you the dining alcove. It seats 20 comfortably. Richard began to walk, trailing his fingertips lightly over the edge of the kitchen island. The marble was flawless, imported from Italy. I don't entertain 20 people, Chloe. I entertain 3 or 4 people who matter. The rest are just noise. He stopped, turning back to face her. His eyes were a dark, unreadable brown, sharp and calculating. He looked at her not as a real estate agent, but as an asset to be evaluated. She felt a sudden, flushed heat creep up the back of her neck. She was acutely aware of the tear in the lining of her blazer, the cheapness of her shoes. She felt exposed, yet intensely seen. "Let me show you the terrace," she said, her voice dropping slightly in pitch. They spent 40 minutes walking through the property. Richard asked few questions about the building's amenities and many questions about her. How long had she been in real estate? Did she like the brutal nature of the market? What was her commission on a place like this? "That's confidential, Mr. Hayes," she said, stopping in the master bathroom, surrounded by brass fixtures and slate tile. "Nothing is confidential, Chloe. It's just a matter of price." He leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed but coiled, like a predator resting in the shade. "You're hungry, I can tell. Most agents at your firm are comfortable, born into the right families, playing at having a job. But you need to close this." She bristled, her defensive instincts flaring. "I am perfectly capable." "I didn't say you weren't capable," he interrupted smoothly. "I said you were hungry. It's a compliment. I prefer people who know what it means to work for their dinner." He checked his watch, a heavy silver piece that caught the light, likely worth more than her entire annual salary. "I'll take the apartment," Chloe blinked, the breath caught in her throat. You will?" "On one condition." He looked up, locking eyes with her. "You let me buy you dinner tonight, to celebrate the close." It was a blatant crossing of a professional boundary. It was unethical. It was a cliché. But as Chloe looked at him, feeling the aching pinch in her toes, and remembering the smell of turpentine waiting for her at home, the objection died on her tongue. "I know a place in Tribeca," Richard said, taking her silence for consent. 8 o'clock. Dinner was a sensory overload that left Chloe entirely unmoored. The restaurant was intensely dark, illuminated only by small, flickering candles on heavy mahogany tables. The air smelled of roasted bone marrow, truffles, and spilled red wine. Richard ordered without looking at the menu. When the food arrived, it was rich, heavy, and decadent. Chloe ate a piece of seared Wagyu beef, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second as it melted against her tongue. It tasted like salvation. It tasted like never having to check a bank balance again. "You're quiet," Richard observed. He was drinking a heavy Bordeaux, the glass dwarfed by his large, manicured hand. "I'm just enjoying the meal," she said, taking a sip of her own wine. It was dry, complex, and coated her throat in velvet. "Tell me about your husband," Richard said, casually, slicing his steak. Chloe froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She hadn't mentioned a husband. She didn't wear a ring. She had pawned her thin gold band 6 months ago to cover an emergency dental bill for Jonah, an act he had accepted with a quiet, heavy nod that still infuriated her. "How do you know I'm married?" Richard smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I do my research on everyone I conduct business with. Jonah, isn't it? Unemployed. Or, sorry, self-employed. A carpenter?" The way he said the word carpenter made it sound like a disease. "He builds furniture," Chloe said defensively, though she didn't know why she was defending him. "I'm sure it's very quaint." Richard set his knife down. "But it doesn't buy you the shoes you want. It doesn't pay for this dinner. It barely pays for the subway ride to show my apartment. That's none of your business. It becomes my business when I see someone with immense potential anchoring themselves to a sinking ship." Richard leaned forward, invading her space, his cologne wrapping around her like a heavy silk scarf. "You are exhausted, Chloe. I see it in the way you carry your shoulders. You're tired of apologizing for wanting more. You're tired of pretending that love is enough to pay the heating bill." Every word was a surgical strike. He was articulating the dark, venomous thoughts she had harbored in the silence of her freezing bedroom. He was validating the ugliest parts of her ambition. He reached across the table, his fingertips brushing the back of her hand. His skin was warm. "Leave him," Richard said, his voice a low, hypnotic hum over the clinking of expensive silverware. "Move into the Mercer with me. Let me show you what your life is actually supposed to look like." Chloe looked down at his hand, touching hers. She thought of Jonah, covered in dust, telling her not to care. She thought of Richard, dropping millions on a whim, recognizing the hunger in her bones. She didn't pull her hand away. The apartment smelled of vanilla and burning wax. When Chloe unlocked the front door at 11:30 p.m., the silence of the hallway was immediately broken by the ticking of the cheap plastic wall clock in the kitchen. The lights were off, save for a single, stout candle burning on the kitchen table. Jonah was sitting there in the semi-darkness. The sandpaper and the salvage chair were gone, replaced by a small, pathetic-looking cupcake sitting on a paper plate. A single unlit match lay next to it. Chloe stopped in the doorway, her hand still clutching the brass knob. The heavy warmth of the Bordeaux she had consumed with Richard instantly soured in her stomach. "You missed dinner," Jonah said. His voice wasn't angry, it was heavy like wet sand. Chloe looked at the cupcake. "What is that?" "It's our anniversary, Chloe. 4 years. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She had completely forgotten. Between the anxiety of the showing, the intoxicating rush of Richard's attention, and the sheer exhaustion of her daily life, the date had entirely slipped her mind. She looked at her husband. He was wearing a clean shirt. He had washed the dust from his hair. He looked up at her, his blue eyes catching the flickering light of the single candle, and for a terrifying second, she saw the boy she had fallen in love with, the quiet, intense man who used to promise her the world before the world ground them down. "Jonah, she stammered, clutching her tote bag tighter. "Did you close the Mercer property?" he asked, not letting her finish her apology. "Yes." "Good, I'm glad." He didn't sound glad. He sounded hollow. He looked down at the cupcake, picking at the edge of the paper plate with his thumb. "I waited until 10. I figured you were out celebrating with the firm." He didn't suspect a thing. He was entirely devoid of jealousy, of suspicion, of the sharp, aggressive possessiveness that Richard had displayed after knowing her for 2 hours. Jonah's trust wasn't a comfort. In that moment, it felt like neglect. It felt like he didn't care enough to worry. A sudden, hot wave of anger washed over her, burning away the guilt. Why should she feel bad? Why was she the villain for wanting a life where anniversaries were celebrated with something more than a $2 cupcake from the corner bodega? "I'm leaving, Jonah," she said. The words fell out of her mouth before she had consciously formed them, landing on the linoleum between them like dropped coins. Jonah stopped picking at the plate. The kitchen was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of the leaky faucet hitting a dirty pan in the sink. Drip, drip, drip. He didn't jump up. He didn't shout. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze locking onto hers. The serenity in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a dark, fathomless disappointment that made her want to shrink backward into the hallway. "Leaving for the night?" he asked softly, though they both knew the answer. "Leaving. I'm packing my things." She broke eye contact, unable to hold the weight of his stare, and walked swiftly past him into the bedroom. She pulled her battered, hard-shell suitcase from beneath the bed. The zipper caught, emitting a loud, harsh screech in the quiet apartment. She began pulling clothes from the hangers, throwing them in haphazardly. Sweaters, cheap blouses, skirts that didn't fit right. She wanted to leave it all behind, but the instinct to hoard what little she owned overrode her desire for a clean break. Jonah appeared in the doorway, his shadow stretched across the worn carpet. "Is there someone else?" he asked. The question wasn't a demand. It was an inquiry, stated with the clinical calm of a doctor diagnosing a fatal illness. "That doesn't matter," Chloe snapped, fighting with a tangled mess of tights. "What matters is that I can't do this anymore, Jonah. I can't live in a freezing apartment. I can't count pennies at the grocery store. I am suffocating and you are just sanding chairs. You don't care. You have zero ambition." "Ambition," Jonah repeated the word as if tasting something foul. "You think because I don't wear a suit and scream at people on a telephone that I don't have ambition." "I think you're comfortable failing," she shouted, finally spinning around to face him. Her chest heaved. "I am killing myself to keep us afloat, and you just sit there, content in the dirt." Jonah looked at her, really looked at her. For a fleeting second, a strange, complicated emotion flickered across his face. It looked almost like pity. It infuriated her. "I could give you everything you want, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a strange, commanding weight she had never heard before. "If you just waited, if you just trusted me." "I've waited 3 years. I'm done waiting." She slammed the suitcase shut, struggling to engage the clasp. Jonah didn't move to help her. He watched her wrestle with the cheap luggage, his jaw tight. When she finally got it closed, she stood up, gripping the plastic handle. She expected him to block the door. She expected him to beg, to promise he would get a real job, to show some kind of primal fight for their marriage. Instead, he stepped aside. "If you walk out that door tonight, Chloe," Jonah said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you don't get to come back when you realize what you've done." "I won't want to," she spat back, her adrenaline blinding her to the finality of the moment. She rolled the suitcase past him. The wheels clattered loudly against the floorboards. She walked through the kitchen, passing the single burning candle and the untouched cupcake. She opened the front door, stepping out into the cold, drafty hallway of the building. She expected him to follow her out. She expected to hear his heavy boots behind her. But as she waited by the elevator, staring at the scuffed metal doors, the only sound she heard was the firm, quiet click of the deadbolt sliding into place from the inside. He had locked her out. 2 hours later, Chloe stepped out of a black town car and walked into the lobby of the Mercer. The concierge greeted her by name. She rode the private elevator up to the penthouse. When the doors opened, Richard was sitting on the leather sofa, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The city lights sprawling behind him like a carpet of diamonds. He stood up, walking toward her, taking the cheap suitcase from her trembling hand and pushing it aside. He pulled her into his chest. He smelled of power, of safety, of infinite resources. "You made the right choice," Richard murmured into her hair. Chloe closed her eyes, breathing in the expensive scent, trying to ignore the sudden, hollow ache in her chest. She had the brass in her hands now. She just had to convince herself it was gold. 6 weeks had passed since she dragged her cheap, rattling suitcase across the threshold of the penthouse. 6 weeks since she had seen Jonah. The divorce papers had been drawn up by Richard's aggressively efficient legal team, couriered to the dilapidated apartment in Brooklyn, and returned 3 days later. Jonah had signed them. He hadn't fought for the apartment, the meager savings account, or her. His signature, rendered in black ink on the bottom of the stark white page, was steady and clean. No angry slashes, no tear stains. Just a quiet, bureaucratic severing of 4 years of marriage. It was exactly what she had wanted, yet the absolute lack of friction left her feeling completely unmoored, swinging wildly in a vacuum. Richard had seamlessly absorbed her into his life, curating her existence the way he curated his art collection. Her worn blazers and scuffed pumps were quietly thrown out by a housekeeper while Chloe was at the spa. In their place, a wardrobe of neutral, tailored designer pieces materialized. Cashmere, silk, vicuña wool. She was draped in fabrics that cost more than her entire college tuition, yet she constantly felt a draft. She stood in front of the master bathroom mirror, dragging a brush through her hair. The harsh, brilliant light of the vanity illuminated the faint, purple shadows under her eyes. She hadn't worked in a month. Richard had insisted she resign from the real estate firm. "You don't need to hustle for pennies anymore," he had told her, pouring a cup of single-origin espresso. "My partners don't want to see my partner begging for commissions." So, she stopped. She spent her days walking through high-end boutiques, drinking sparkling water infused with cucumber, and waiting for Richard to return. The front door chimed. Heavy leather-soled footsteps echoed across the hard wood. Chloe set the brush down on the marble counter, the sharp clack loud in the sterile silence of the bathroom. She walked out to the living area. Richard was shrugging off his overcoat, handing it to his assistant, David, who hovered silently near the foyer. "Traffic on the FDR was a nightmare," Richard snapped, loosening his silk tie with a sharp, irritated yank. He didn't look at Chloe as she approached. His face, usually a mask of relaxed, predatory confidence, was drawn tight. A vein pulsed visibly at his temple. "Rough day at the office?" Chloe asked, keeping her voice light, testing the waters. Richard finally looked at her. His dark eyes swept over her beige cashmere lounge set, evaluating and approving the aesthetic before meeting her gaze. "The acquisition in Berlin is stalling. and the holding company is breathing down my neck about quarterly projections. He walked over to the wet bar, pouring 2 fingers of Macallan into a crystal tumbler. The ice cracked sharply as the amber liquid hit it. "I thought you were the CEO," Chloe said, leaning against the kitchen island. "Don't you make the final call on the projections?" Richard stopped, the glass halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, a slow, patronizing smile spreading across his face. It was the same smile he used when a waiter brought the wrong vintage of wine. "I run the subsidiary, Chloe. Hayes Global is an arm of a much larger body. I answer to a board. I answer to the majority shareholder." He took a long swallow of the whiskey. "It's a dog and pony show. You keep the people with the actual capital happy, and they let you play in their sandbox." He sounded bitter. It was a microscopic crack in the flawless, impenetrable armor he wore. Chloe felt a sudden, sharp spike of unease. She had traded her life for a man who projected absolute power, only to realize he was just a highly paid employee terrified of his boss. "Well, I'm sure you'll handle it," she said, stepping closer, reaching out to touch his arm. Richard flinched slightly at her touch, pulling his arm back just a fraction of an inch. "I have to. The annual shareholder gala is this Friday. The founder's family is sending a representative, the actual heir. He never attends these things, but suddenly he's making an appearance." Richard ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the part. "He's a ghost. Nobody has seen him in a boardroom in 5 years. If he's coming, it means he's looking for blood." He walked past her, heading toward his home office. "Have Maria steam the emerald gown for Friday, and wear your hair up. You need to look elegant, not like you're going to a nightclub." The office door clicked shut. Chloe stood alone in the massive, echoing living room. The smell of Richard's cologne, bergamot and metal, hung heavily in the air, cloying and synthetic. She looked down at her hands. The calluses she used to have on her palms from hauling groceries up 3 flights of stairs were completely gone, softened by expensive lotions and idle days. Suddenly, with a ferocity that stole her breath, she caught a phantom scent in the back of her mind. Cedarwood, wood shavings, stale coffee. She closed her eyes, her fingernails digging into the soft flesh of her palms. She missed Jonah. She missed the grating sound of sandpaper in the kitchen. She missed the infuriating, calm anchor of his presence. It was a pathetic, useless realization, and she shoved it down violently, burying it under the cold, heavy weight of the marble countertops and the silence of the penthouse. She had chosen the brass. She had to polish it. Preparation for the Whitmore holdings. Gala felt less like dressing for a party and more like armoring for a siege. The penthouse was swarming with stylists by 3 in the afternoon. Chloe sat in a low leather chair while a woman named Sabine aggressively pinned her hair into a tight architectural twist at the base of her neck. The pulling gave Chloe a dull, pulsing headache behind her left eye. The air smelled of aerosol hairspray, hot iron coils, and the sharp acetone of nail polish remover. Richard paced the perimeter of the bedroom. He was already dressed in a bespoke tuxedo that fit him with frightening precision. He held a phone to his ear, his voice a low, furious hiss. "I don't care if the margin is tight, David. You massage the numbers before they get to the executive committee. If he asks about the overhead in the logistics division, I need a pivot. No, I am not taking the fall for..." Richard paused, his knuckles turning white around the phone. Just fix it. He ended the call, tossing the phone onto the unmade bed. He walked over to Chloe, stopping behind her chair to look at her reflection in the mirror. "The necklace," he commanded, holding his hand out to one of the hovering assistants. A velvet box was placed in his palm. He popped it open, lifting a heavy, staggering diamond and emerald collar from the satin indent. He leaned down, draping it around Chloe's neck. The metal was ice cold against her collarbone. It was heavy, so heavy it made her want to hunch her shoulders forward. "Perfect," Richard muttered, fastening the clasp. His fingers were cold, too. "Remember tonight, Chloe. Speak when spoken to, but keep it light. No opinions on the market. If anyone asks about your background, you come from boutique commercial real estate. You do not mention Brooklyn. You do not mention your ex-husband." Chloe looked at her reflection. She looked like a stranger. The emerald dress clung to her ribs like a second skin, restricting her breathing. The diamonds at her throat felt like a glittering, expensive leash. "Who exactly am I trying to impress, Richard?" she asked, her voice tight. "You've been vibrating with anxiety all week over this heir." "What's his name?" Richard stepped back, adjusting his cufflinks. "It doesn't matter what his name is. He owns 60% of the voting shares. His family built the infrastructure this entire city runs on. He stepped away a few years ago, some sort of existential crisis, rumor has it. But his proxy has been voting on his behalf. Now, he's back. And if he doesn't like the way I'm running Hayes Global, he can dissolve my position with a single signature." The vulnerability in Richard's voice disgusted her. It was pathetic. She had destroyed her marriage to be with a king, and here he was, sweating in a tuxedo, terrified of a man he had never even met. "Then we will smile, and we will charm him," Chloe said, standing up. The dress pooled perfectly around her feet. She grabbed a small, rigid clutch that barely held her lipstick. "Let's go secure your sandbox, Richard." The gala was held in the vaulted atrium of the Natural History Museum. The massive dinosaur skeletons had been illuminated with deep purple and gold uplighting, casting long, monstrous shadows against the limestone walls. The room was packed with hundreds of people, all operating on a frequency of low, murmuring hostility disguised as polite conversation. Chloe walked beside Richard, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. The muscle beneath his jacket was rigid. They spent the first hour navigating the floor, Richard exchanging terse greetings with men who all looked like slight variations of himself. Chloe drank 2 glasses of champagne in rapid succession. The bubbles tasted sour, sitting heavily in her empty stomach. "There's the chairman of the board," Richard muttered, his hand suddenly gripping Chloe's waist with enough force to bruise. "And he's walking with someone." Chloe followed his gaze through the sea of tuxedos and sequined gowns. A ripple was moving through the crowd. It was a subtle, physical shift in the room's gravity. People were stepping aside, lowering their voices, their eyes tracking a small group of men moving toward the center of the atrium. "Is that him?" Chloe asked, squinting against the harsh glare of a photographer's flash. "It has to be," Richard said. His voice was a thin, reedy thing now, completely stripped of its usual baritone power. He smoothed his lapels, his breathing shallow. "Look at how the chairman is deferring to him. God, he looks young. Come on, we need to intercept them before the regional directors do." Richard grabbed her wrist, not her hand, her wrist, and pulled her forward. Chloe stumbled slightly in her heels, her ankle rolling in the stiff leather pumps. She caught her balance, a flash of pure, unadulterated anger burning through her chest. "Don't pull me," she hissed, yanking her arm back. But Richard wasn't listening. He had pasted on a wide, obsequious smile, stepping directly into the path of the approaching group. "Mr. Chairman," Richard said smoothly, extending a hand. "A pleasure, as always. And you must be—" Richard's voice trailed off. Chloe stepped up beside him, rubbing her wrist, her eyes fixed on the floor. She took a breath, composed her face into a perfect, vacant smile, and looked up at the billionaire heir, holding the fate of Richard's entire existence in his hands. Her heart stopped. It didn't flutter. It didn't race. It seized completely, slamming against her ribs like a dying bird. The air left her lungs in a violent, silent rush. Champagne flutes clinked in a disjointed rhythm nearby. A fragile, glassy percussion that suddenly sounded like shattering windows. The dull roar of 100 conversations dissolved into static in Chloe's ears. Standing 3 feet away from her, flanked by elderly billionaires who were looking at him with a mixture of reverence and fear, was Jonah. He was wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that draped over his broad shoulders with a fluid, terrifying elegance. His hair, usually dusted with wood shavings and falling into his eyes, was neatly swept back. He looked immaculate. He looked ruthless. He looked exactly like the man he was. Chloe felt the floor tilt. A cold, aggressive wave of nausea hit the back of her throat. "No," her brain chanted, a frantic skipping record. "No, no, no." This was Jonah. Her Jonah. The man who sat in the dark with a $2 cupcake. The man who sanded garbage furniture on a fire escape. The man who couldn't pay a heating bill. But as she looked closer, her mind frantically searching for the lie, she saw the truth hiding in plain sight. She saw the heavy silver watch on his wrist, the one he had claimed was a fake from a pawn shop. She saw the way he held his posture, completely unbothered, commanding the space without raising his voice. It wasn't the slow, aimless lethargy of a beaten man. It was the absolute, unshakable stillness of a man who owned the ground he stood on. "I could give you everything you want, Chloe, if you just waited, if you just trusted me." His final words to her echoed in the cavernous museum, louder than the string quartet playing in the corner. "Jonah?" The word slipped out of her mouth, a pathetic, broken whisper. Richard didn't hear her. He was too busy staring at the man in front of him. Richard's hand was still extended, hanging awkwardly in the empty space between them. Jonah looked at Richard's hand. He didn't take it. "Hayes," Jonah said. His voice was exactly the same, calm, deep, unhurried, but without the warmth it used to hold for her. Now it was a weapon. "I've been reviewing the logistics reports for your subsidiary." Richard's confident facade shattered instantly. His hand dropped to his side, his shoulders hunching slightly. He looked smaller. In the presence of actual, undeniable power, Richard Hayes was nothing more than a frightened middle manager. "Mr. Whitmore," Richard stammered, the name confirming Chloe's deepest, most horrifying realization. Yes, the reports. We've had some supply chain friction in the Berlin sector, but I assure you, friction is an excuse for poor foresight," Jonah interrupted quietly. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. "You burned $30 million in capital to secure a warehouse facility that is currently operating at 40% capacity. You don't have a supply chain problem, Hayes. You have an ego problem. You wanted your name on the lease before the quarter ended. Richard swallowed audibly. A bead of sweat broke out at his hairline, catching the purple light of the atrium. I was advised that the market share would expand. You were advised poorly, Jonah said, cutting him down with casual brutality. We'll discuss your restructuring tomorrow at 9. Bring your legal counsel. It was a public execution. Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He nodded, entirely stripped of his dignity, a king reduced to a peasant in the span of 30 seconds. Yes, of course, Mr. Whitmore. Only then did Jonah shift his gaze. His brilliant, clear blue eyes bypassed Richard entirely and locked onto Chloe. The silence between them was deafening. Chloe's hands were shaking so violently she had to grip her rigid clutch with both hands to keep from dropping it. Her chest heaved against the tight silk of her dress. She wanted him to look angry. She wanted him to sneer, to gloat, to show some sign of vindictive triumph. But there was nothing. Jonah looked at the heavy emeralds digging into her collarbone. He looked at the perfect tight twist of her hair. He looked at the terrified, hollow expression on her face. And in his eyes, Chloe saw the exact same look he had given her in their freezing kitchen the night she left. Pity. He felt sorry for her. He was looking at a woman who had traded away a quiet, unbreakable devotion for a frightened, cruel man in a rented tuxedo. Chloe couldn't breathe. The air in the museum was suddenly too thin, too hot. Her skin crawled under the weight of the diamonds. She opened her mouth to speak, to say his name, to beg, to explain. But there were no words. The absurdity of her own greed choked her. Jonah held her gaze for 3 devastating seconds. Then he simply looked away. He stepped around Richard as if he were a piece of misplaced furniture, disappearing into the crowd of executives, leaving behind the faint, lingering scent of cedarwood. Chloe stood frozen under the towering skeleton of a predator, the cold, heavy brass of her new life, finally, suffocatingly, wrapping around her throat. The back of the Maybach smelled of fear. Richard's expensive bergamot cologne had soured, mixing with the sharp, acidic stench of his anxious sweat. The soundproof cabin, designed to block out the noise of the city, now trapped every ragged, shallow breath he took. He did not sit back against the plush headrest. He perched on the absolute edge of the leather seat, one leg bouncing with a frantic, jittery energy that shook the entire row. Outside the tinted windows, the streetlights smeared into long, jaundiced yellow streaks across the glass. He's going to gut the subsidiary, Richard muttered, aggressively chewing the inside of his cheek. He was staring at the partition separating them from the driver, though his eyes were unfocused, tracing invisible disaster scenarios on the black upholstery. 9 a.m. He didn't even give me the weekend to prepare a defense. He just stood there and cut my legs out from under me in front of the entire executive committee. $30 million. He brought up the Berlin logistics failure like he was discussing the weather. Chloe did not answer. She sat rigidly in her corner of the car, her hands folded tight in her lap. The emerald collar dug into her throat, the stones sharp against her clavicle. It felt like a chain pulling her toward the floorboards. Richard turned his head. His dark eyes were wild, completely stripped of the manufactured boardroom confidence that had drawn her to him just weeks ago. He looked small. His bow tie was crooked, the top button of his shirt undone. In the presence of Jonah's absolute, unbothered power, Richard had been reduced to a terrified middle manager who had just been caught skimming from the register. "Did you see the way he looked at you?" Richard demanded, his voice thin and reedy. Chloe swallowed hard. The back of her throat tasted like copper and bile. "He didn't look at me." "Don't lie to me." Richard's hand shot out, his fingers wrapped around her wrist, his thumb pressing viciously into the bruised indent he had made earlier at the museum. "He stopped talking. He bypassed me entirely, and he looked at you. Why?" "Let go of me, Richard," she whispered. Her voice cracked, a pathetic, dry sound. Richard didn't let go. He pulled her slightly closer, his pupils dilating as his brain furiously processed the variables. He was a man who survived on data, on recognizing patterns, and the fragmented pieces of information were suddenly aligning in his head. "Your last name," Richard said, his voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper. "When you worked at the boutique firm, I saw it on the contract. Chloe Whitmore." He said the name slowly, tasting the syllables, testing the weight of the realization. He stared at her face, reading the terrifying confirmation in her wide, panicked eyes. "Jonah," Richard whispered. A harsh, barking laugh erupted from his chest, entirely devoid of humor. It was the sound of a man watching his own house burn down. He let go of her wrist and fell back against the leather seat, running both hands over his face. Jonah Whitmore, the carpenter, the unemployed, deadbeat carpenter who builds salvaged furniture. He turned his head slowly to look at her again. The disgust in his eyes was absolute. "You were married to the majority shareholder of Hayes Global." Chloe closed her eyes. She wanted to disappear into the heavy leather upholstery. She wanted the car to swerve and hit a concrete barricade, just to end the suffocating humiliation expanding in her chest. She remembered the thin gold band she had pawned to pay for Jonah's dental work. The quiet nod he had given her. He had the money. He had all of it. He had let her pawn her ring. He had let her freeze in that apartment. "You stupid, greedy woman!" Richard spat, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated cruelty. He leaned closer to her, his breath hot and stale against her cheek. "You had the keys to the entire kingdom. You were married to a man who owns the skyline, and you left him for a regional CEO because he bought you a steak and a cheap cashmere sweater." Every word was a precision strike. Richard was taking his immense, castrating humiliation and weaponizing it against the only target he had left. "I didn't know," Chloe choked out. A single hot tear spilled over her lower lash line, ruining the expensive makeup Sabine had spent an hour applying. "He never told me. We were starving, Richard. We couldn't pay the heating bill. The water ran cold for days." "Because he was testing you!" Richard shouted, slamming his fist against the leather door panel. The heavy thud made the driver flinch visibly in the rearview mirror. "Men like that, men born with that kind of capital, they don't trust anyone. He wanted to know what you were made of when the money was gone. And you failed. You failed so spectacularly that you dragged me down with you." Richard leaned back, adjusting his cuffs with trembling, frantic fingers. "When he looks at my quarterly projections tomorrow, he's not going to see a logistics failure. He's going to see the idiot who took his garbage out for him." They did not speak for the rest of the ride. When the private elevator doors opened into the penthouse, The silence of the massive apartment was deafening. There was no clanging radiator. There were no wood shavings scattered on the floor. There was just vast, empty space, perfectly temperature controlled and entirely devoid of life. Richard walked straight to his office without looking back. He didn't offer to take her coat. He didn't pour a drink. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a gunshot. A moment later, the muffled, violent sound of glass shattering against drywall bled through the corridor. Chloe stood alone in the foyer. She reached behind her neck, her fingers fumbling blindly with the complicated clasp of the diamond and emerald necklace. Her hands were shaking too badly. The tiny metal hook slipped from her grasp twice. Finally, she dug her manicured nails into the metal, tearing at the chain until the clasp snapped. The heavy jewelry slipped off her collarbone and hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, unceremonious clatter. It left a red, raw welt across her skin. She kicked her rigid heels off, leaving them abandoned on the expensive Persian rug, and walked barefoot across the cold floor to the floor-to-ceiling windows. 50 stories below, the city was alive. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Cabs crawled through the gridlock like glowing yellow insects. Down there, people were struggling. People were arguing over electric bills, splitting cheap dinners, and leaning on each other for warmth. She thought of Jonah's hands. Rough, calloused, covered in the pale dust of sanded wood. She thought of the heavy, steady rhythm of his breathing in the dark, the scent of cedar wood and turpentine that had permeated his skin. He hadn't been stagnant. He had simply stepped off the treadmill that the rest of the world was killing themselves on. He had wanted a life built on quiet, durable things. He had wanted to know that if the money, the power, and the status were stripped away, she would still sit at a cheap linoleum table with him and share a $2 cupcake. She hadn't just failed a test. She had proven his thesis. Chloe pressed her forehead against the freezing glass. The chill seeped through her skin, sinking deep into the bone. She looked around the cavernous, immaculate living room. The Italian marble island, the custom pendant lighting, the absolute unassailable luxury. She had finally gotten the brass she had so desperately craved. She had polished it, worshipped it, and traded away her only source of true warmth to acquire it. Now, she was locked inside a gilded cage with a terrified, cruel man, knowing that the real gold was out there, walking away, and the door was permanently locked behind him. She wrapped her arms around her own chest, shivering in her designer silk, completely and utterly bankrupt. That concludes Chloe's devastating journey of ambition and regret. Sometimes the grass isn't greener, it's just painted with a toxic veneer. If this story of shattered illusions, bitter truths, and the heavy price of chasing the wrong kind of wealth struck a chord with you, please hit that like button to help the channel grow. Leave a comment down below. Do you think Chloe deserved her cold, gilded cage? Or did Jonah push her too far with his secret? Share this video with someone who loves grounded, realistic drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more deeply human storytelling.